Hi, this is Tim Lightfellow in the Kingdom of Ontario, Society for Creative Anachronism. Today I am doing a video to show some uh, maintenance and also just kind of show how to like disassemble and reassemble parts of a crossbow. Um, I will start by specifying that I'm not doing a push pin style because there's less to do with those. But what and I should also specify I'm not showing ones that use like a sinew or an artificial sinew to lock the prod in. So I'm using a roller nut style crossbow. I am using a crossbow with bow irons and metal wedges and spacers to lock the crossbow prod in place. And that would be the cat. I have a helper, as you can see. Okay, so the things I want to go over is like what do I have in my toolkit on an archery range specific for crossbow, because my kit has a little of everything for every type of bow so that I can help people out. But specific to crossbow, I like to carry a couple of just little handheld hammers. These were, I think, maybe $4 or $5 at Harbor Freight. I mean, you don't need super high quality or anything. And obviously, whatever you happen to have, if you can't afford to go buy special ones, I'm certainly not saying you have to. I just got these, I think about 4 or 5 years ago. Prior to that, I'd just grabbed the hammers in the house because I couldn't afford these. Since I was able to afford them, they generally live in the archery kit so that I have them at events, because whenever I have to take the prod off or if the prod gets loose and I need to tighten it, that's what I use. I also use as I recall, they sell this as a pin punch. This particular one is 1/8 inch. In order to get this, I had to buy a set. I had bought some that they sold individually prior to this, but the punch portion was narrower. And what I found is after a short time, they would actually start bending. And once they bend, they're no use for what I'm using them for. So I found one that's a little bit thicker, but is still thin enough to line up on the end of the wedges and get the job done. And again, there are other alternatives, a flathead screwdriver, possibly a small chisel or something if you're careful with it, or if it's already really dull and kind of beyond using as a chisel. But other ideas that could work that maybe you already have around the house. I carry a screwdriver that actually has replaceable bits, has spare bits in the handle, and in this one actually has ratcheting, which is a nice added feature. Um, Frankly, I don't even remember where this came from. But the point of this is if I ever have to take off the crossbow finger bolt pinch, trying to think, I've heard multiple terms for it, but the part that holds the crossbow bolt down to the deck or table of the crossbow. I have on the current crossbow that I'm going to be showing Phillips screws, because that came from the person who made this crossbow for me. On my other ones, I actually have square head screws, so I have a square head bit in here as well. And again, just cheap little one, trying to go for small enough to fit into a kit, but effective enough to do the task I need. Small tape measure, this one's 12 feet, which is way more than I need. It just happened to be that we had a bunch around the house, most of them larger, and so I grabbed the small one so that I could keep it in my kit. Because I find, obviously, larger ones for measuring things around the house are better. So those are the tools that tend to be in my travel kit. In addition, I generally carry, sometimes I have a spare roller nut with me just in case. I'm going to be honest, those, when I've had them fail, as it were, it tends to be more that they have a, let's see if I can show you. They have a metal plate. So here's one that's actually not in a crossbow right now. So it has this metal plate at the bottom, and the trigger holds against that, because if the trigger were straight against the plastic vinyl material, it just wears it out really fast. So you have a metal plate with the trigger against it, and eventually, with all the rubbing from pulling the trigger, it slowly both tends to kind of wear down and run the trigger, and it'll wear the plate down. And so what you'll end up with is you'll get to a point where maybe the trigger is no longer actually catching, or it's just barely catching and you barely touch it and it shoots. That can be a sign that it's time to check your roller nut and possibly do something. You can also, if you have that, check your trigger and see if you can maybe square it off a little better. But the point being, sometimes I have one, sometimes I don't, but usually, I mean, this wears down in such a slow period that you will probably know, I mean, you would know well ahead of time that you need to do it. And so usually you're going to probably do it at home as a maintenance thing rather than some sort of emergency at an event, unless you're maybe at a 4 or 5 day, week-long type event. Okay, I used to carry a spare crossbow finger, bolt pinch, whatever, with me, because I used to actually make my own. I don't even have an example of the ones I was making. They're aluminum, but after so many uses, the aluminum would start to bend, and once it started to bend, it would eventually get to a point where you had a weak spot and it would crack. And once it did that, it was no good. So I'd often carry a spare one of those. This is one made by, I think, a friend of the person who made the crossbow that I'm going to be showing. So this came with the crossbow, and the one on the crossbow actually came from a maker in Canada that used to also sell crossbows. That's, I think their name is Viking Archery Treasures or something to that effect. I'm not sure if they're even around anymore and making stuff still. But anyway, so spare crossbow fingers, spare crossbow prod. If I'm going to be at a few day event, if I'm noticing that it's shooting a little funny, I'll often try and have a spare prod with me so I can swap it out rather than have it break and be done for the day. At home, I also have some white lithium grease, and I will go over what that's for. So, to begin with, on a crossbow, for any who may not be super familiar with the terms, and these are the terms I'm aware of, and the more I talk to people, the more I'm aware that there are different terms out there that different people use. So please don't take this as a comprehensive, this is what you must call it list. This is the terms I'm familiar with. So this I've always heard called the stirrup, which is the piece that you hook onto your foot so you can draw it. Not all crossbows have those. Some people will choose to put the crossbow into the side of their hip and draw it that way. especially if they also use it for combat. This part is called the prod. In this case, I'm using steel. I am familiar with fiberglass, which actually is on my wife's crossbow. I am also familiar with some people using wood laminate prods. This area, all this is usually just generically referred to as the bow irons. So this is a couple of flat pieces and a couple of wedges to drive in to push those apart and lock all of this in place. This is, again, the crossbow finger or the bolt pinch. This would be the deck or the table of the bow. This would be the, let's see, the trigger or the, I'm suddenly drawing a blank. I've heard several names for it. And one of them, yeah, I recognize them when I see them, but I can't think of them to say what they are. And this inside here is the roller nut. The way this one is assembled, again, has the bow irons up front. This bolt and this bolt are what I've always heard referred to as Chicago screws, which I think might also have the name of Corby bolts. So basically, it's one smooth outer with an opening that's threaded inside, and then the other side's a screw that screws into that threaded part. So you'll see what that looks. Actually, since we're on the topic, I have spare ones in the kit. So the idea is, if I can find the screw side. So this one actually has an extension, but basically you have a screw in one end, and then the other side is a tube with a threading on the inside, or in this case, there's an extension. So you have the tube with the threading there, then you have an add-on so that it would fit across the crossbow body, and then you have the screw that goes in the other side. So that's what I'm referring to if I only say like Chicago screw later on. You know what I am talking about. So that's what's here and that's what's here. That allows the trigger to have a smooth axle for moving. There's a spring inside to make this trigger want to be in this position. So if you let go, it wants to go return to that position. And then there's, again, a Chicago screw here, giving this a smooth axle to spin on. Okay. I will point out that I've seen some crossbows where instead of this bolt, what people do is they'll have another hole down lower and they'll use artificial sinew or something to create an axle that goes through this and then through down there and ties off. So again, trying to think through the variations. There are other crossbows that use clap locks, and my wife's actually does, and I have had to do basically no maintenance specific to the clap lock that I'm thinking of. I think we had to replace clap locks use two springs inside, one for the trigger, one to make the lock want to pop up. So I think we had to replace one of the springs, but because those are far less common from what I've seen and less of a maintenance thing from what my experience, I wanted to focus on this style because this seems to be the one that uses the most stuff. So first thing is, if you want to replace the roller nut, most of the time you must take off the crossbow finger. And so I will start with that. And that is this screwdriver. And this is currently set to loosen. So This is the part where it gets a little boring watching as I actually do the work, and there's not a whole lot to say as I do it. I will say, I will comment now while I'm taking these out, that when I'm putting them back in, and usually when I'm taking back out, if I get near the end, I'll stop and use my hand. And when I'm putting back in, I will get them started by hand to make sure I'm not forcing it with the screwdriver and cross-threading the holes. Because I've experienced having to try to fill in a hole and re-drill and do the screws. Okay. Now the one thing that I forgot is that the Chicago screws kind of require 2 screwdrivers. So let's see if I can make this act. Nope. I know what I can do. I have a toolkit down here that, while it doesn't have a screwdriver, it does have screwdriver bits, which should work well enough for me to do this, I hope. It does not. So I will, unfortunately, as I take a fast look, just in case I left screwdriver anywhere, I will need to go grab a screwdriver very fast. I apologize. I will be right back. What I'm trying to do is the Chicago screws require a screwdriver on both sides, and I inconveniently forgot that. Oh, I know. I don't have to go anywhere. I have the magic of the Leatherman in the archery kit at my feet. There we go. So, screwdrivers. There we go. Okay. Back on track. So you can see that, you know, I don't always remember to put everything out before I do these videos. But that's okay. Okay, so the interesting thing I've found when removing the roller nut is it's usually hard to pull this out, though on this one it isn't, with the trigger up. So there have been times on my other one I have to literally engage the trigger to be able to get the roller nut out. There's the roller nut. So, and it's not going to show, but right under the end of the trigger end there is the spring that makes the trigger want to come back up and lock in the roller nut. I've not found a need to do any maintenance on that spring unless you end up shooting so much you have to replace it. What I have found is, again, you have metal here and you have metal on the trigger. So what I will often do is put a little white grease right on this metal pad, and that can help keep the trigger smooth and keep the trigger from wanting to catch when you're pulling it. I will also occasionally put white grease in the middle of this so that as it spins on the axle, it's actually spinning a little more smoothly because there's lubrication there. What I'm hoping to do at the moment, since I'm doing this video anyway, is we have a test roller nut made out of a 3D printed resin, which at my home range, so totally not SCA related, I'm planning to test and see how well it holds up. We tested a 3D printed roller nut made out of the base plastic material that 3D printers use, and it was way too brittle and cracked after one end. So that's something that we are not wanting to see on the range, but we're hoping that maybe this will work, because as 3D printers get a little less expensive, if we can find something that actually works and holds up to the abuse, it might make it a little cheaper, a little more accessible for people. So make sure the trigger is locking in place. Switch this back to Titan. In this case, since it is resin, I don't know what effect white grease will have on it, so I am not going to put grease on the roller nut. And to be clear, I am not any kind of material sciences person. So okay, there is that part. Next, we put the crossbow finger back on. Like I said, I start the screws out by hand to make sure they're not cross-threading before I hit them with the screwdriver, because I don't want to have to redo holes. A little worried about that one. That one's good. I'm going to double check this one. It seems to be good. Okay. Another thing I'll do is, I'll tighten the mold down most of the way, and then I will check it, because on this particular crossbow finger, there's just a little play in the screw holes, and the very end of it is fairly narrow, so I want to make sure it's lined up the best possible with the channel for the crossbow bolt, because if it's off to the side very far, it's not going to be very useful. So I'm actually at the moment kind of holding it towards me as I tighten this down, trying to make sure I don't over tighten. That is something I've also experienced, is breaking a screw off in one of the holes. So what I was talking about is the end of this is really narrow, and there's, let's see if I can get the light to show it. There's a channel for the crossbow bolt to sit in, and so I want this above that channel, so it's actually holding the bolt. It doesn't take much for this to be completely off to the side, to where it wouldn't actually be holding it or doing any good. Okay. Next step is taking off the prod. So I am going to see if I can do this in a way that lets you see this on camera. So forgive me while the camera moves. Okay, so the camera's okay, but it's not wanting to stay put. Okay, so the reason I use the pin punch is that it is about the same width as the edge of the wedges here. So I'm literally just trying to take the very end of the wedge pieces, and it's already loose, and push them, and that lets these come out. So again, you have wedge shapes that interlock with each other. You have a front piece which is just as wide as the crossbow body, so it locks against the crossbow body. And you have a back piece that's a bit wider because it has to go across the crossbow body and the bow irons. And once that's all off, all this is off. And now it's just kind of a wooden stick that's shaped. So set those down. So the next thing I want to do is I want to check this prod. I was thinking this was one of my lighter prods. And if it is, I want to swap it out. So I always recommend having a spare prod or two. My nickname is Prod Killer, so I tend to have lots of spares. And I tend to apparently knock over the camera. I don't know what the problem is with this camera, but it is barely wanting to stay put. Okay, so this one on the back claims to be 90 pounds. My concern here is this crossbow was designed for a prod that was a lot more V-shaped than this. So if you look at some of these, you'll notice if you put the centers together, I'm hoping you can see this. You'll notice that this tip is higher than this tip. So this one is more angled and this one is more flat. Where that matters is what the crossbow is made for. So if this is more flat and the crossbow was set up for one that's more angled, you're going to have the string just really riding against the deck or table of the crossbow, which is going to wear the serving out more and can wear out the string itself too. So I think that's why I actually had that prod on here, was that it was probably my most angled prod. Another thing I do, because of my nickname, notice that says no good, very bad. That way I remind myself not to try to reuse that prod. Okay, so that one seems to be about the same. And it's stiffer. So again, the reason I'm swapping it out, it allows me to show this on the video, but also we're trying to test the roller nut. We tested it with about an 75, 80 pound prod for several ends. So we're trying to get a little more weight on it and see if it still holds up to the pressure on the trigger. So I'm trying to find one that is a heavier prod that will perform that function for us. So I will point out, let me try and angle the camera up. Okay, so on the stirrup in this case, the bow irons all came from Alchem. So the stirrup has little groove cutouts, which lock into place on the bow irons. And that's what holds it in place. And then this provides a flat surface to push against the prod to hold the prod against the body of the crossbow. So that's the basics of the mechanics. Sometimes you can end up These actually got painted, but you can end up with these or with these metal bits being rusty. And what I'll do is I'll take like some quadruple aught steel wool and wipe them down. You can use a little WD-40 or something, but you want to be careful not to actually lubricate the wedges, because then they'll just keep coming loose. One trick I've occasionally done, and it doesn't look like I've had to on these, sometimes I've had these that were too smooth, and I'll literally just kind of file little cross grooves in them. That way they can interlock a little bit, because rough surface will tend to grab better than a smooth surface. Stirrups, the ones from Alchem, have a point, so you know which end goes to the bottom of the crossbow. In this case, the other part of that, like I said, he made this for a very V-shaped prod instead of a flat prod. And so what he noticed was the top of the stirrup would have actually been in front of the prod and in the way of the path. So he ground that out so that the crossbow bolt can go right through. So that tells me top versus bottom. And I have to remember, I think these, so normally if you look at these, the top's angled. On most crossbows, it would go this way so that it slopes down towards the bottom of the crossbow. But on this one, I think because of the angle that he did for the prod, I think it angles up. So I'm going to line that up and see if that's right for the holes in the side. And it is. So I'm going to put that in. I'm going to take the back piece, which was the one with the extra wide cutout. I'm going to put that in place. Let me raise this so that it's more obvious what I'm doing. I'm going to push this through the hole and down to help lock this in place. And then this piece goes in on top and locks itself just to the body. Then these cross pieces act as wedges to tighten it all up. What you'll notice on these is the end is usually 90 degrees to one side and then a different angle to the other. So in other words, this was probably square stock that got cut at an angle. So I try to make sure that it's the angled part that's going against the other wedge, because then I'm going to have a flat end to hit with the hammer instead of doing it this way and having a slightly angled end, which will then slowly wear down as I take it apart and put it back together too many times. So there's that. So there's the basics. Now, what I like to do is that I know that this channel is center on the body. And I'm just double checking that on this particular one since it's brand new. Okay, so what I will do as I assemble it, I didn't have the center marked on the prod. What I'll do sometimes, and I'm trying to look fast to see if any of the prods here have it so I can show you, is I don't see it. What I'll try to do usually is put a little mark just dead center on the prod. I have the heat shrink, so I'm writing on the heat shrink, and I'll just put just a little mark so I can quickly check to see if it's obviously shifted off center or not, so that like if I'm in a tournament and it feels like it's just shooting not right, I can do a quick double check visually. Since I haven't done that, and when I'm reassembling these, what I do is I check from inside the middle of the groove for the bolt out to where the string goes on the tip. So this is just shy of 13 3/4. And this is just over 13.5. So it needs to go that way. So I'm going to carefully, that's why I haven't tightened it down yet, is now I get to play with centering the prod before I actually lock it in place. I had one prod that I kept taking the crossbow apart and recentering because I swore the way it was shooting it was off center, and what it was that the prod was pulling more on one side than the other. It had the start of basically metal fatigue, and so what I attributed to it being off center was actually the prod starting to fail. So which is that one that's down there that's marked very bad, no good. So it is very noticeable, usually, if you're familiar with how your crossbow should shoot. If the prod ends up off center, you usually can tell that your aim point shifted to the side, often significantly if it's shifted much. Okay, I need to go about another 1/16 of an inch. And I went a little too far. And that went back too far. Okay, let's see. So okay, that looks good. And now this is the part where it gets noisy. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to gently tap these so that I can move this without it shifting the prod. Now I'm going to hold this in my legs, and I'm going to literally tap those together until it's nice and tight. So that is the process for taking prod off, putting a prod on. One thing I would caution that I mentioned in the I'll bring it back up here now. One thing I would caution that I mentioned in the crossbow safety video I did is if you don't take it apart very often, and especially being here in the Seattle area and high humidity, these can get rusty and they can literally rust in place, and it can be very hard to break them apart. So if you start to see rust on these, I would recommend is probably worth taking them out, cleaning the rust off, putting it back together just to prevent it from becoming rusted together and causing you grief whenever it comes time to actually replace the prod. So I think that pretty much covers things. I will discuss that you can clean the wood with whatever wood cleaner you would normally use, and then oil it to give it a good finish again. The person who made this used a teak oil, but pretty much any like wood furniture oil should do a good job. I've heard of using even gunstock oil with the wood crossbow body. So a couple options for ways to redo the finish if you notice it's getting grimy, getting to the point where it's actually not got much finish left on it. Because again, if you live in humidity areas, if the wood gets wet, it can warp, and that can affect the way you have to aim and everything. So keeping it sealed is always beneficial. I hope this helps. It's kind of a an impromptu video, and unfortunately it probably shows, but I tried to go over all the pieces that you can and may have to do maintenance on, and some options, hopefully, for some different tools and that can help. Thank you for watching.